The human mind has a curious way of betraying us when we need it most. It whispers lies in our darkest moments, convinces us that up is down, that danger is safety, that salvation lies in the very direction that will destroy us. This is the story of a brilliant man whose own intellect became his executioner, whose final words to the world revealed a truth so disturbing that it would haunt the maritime rescue community for decades to come. What you're about to discover isn't just another tale of man versus sea. It's a psychological thriller that unfolds on the vast emptiness of the Atlantic Ocean, where a retired physician's carefully planned solo voyage transformed into a descent into madness so complete, so methodical, that his last radio transmission would leave investigators questioning everything they thought they knew about human judgment under extreme stress. By the end of this story, you'll understand why experienced sailors still refuse to speak his name above a whisper, and why his final message became a case study in maritime psychology programs around the world. This isn't just about sailing. It's about the terrifying fragility of the human mind when pushed beyond its limits, and how the very qualities that make us exceptional can become the instruments of our destruction. Dr. Harold Whitmore was the kind of man who measured twice and cut once in everything. At 64, he had spent 38 years as a general practitioner in the coastal town of Brighton, where his patients knew him as methodical, brilliant, and utterly reliable. His waiting room walls were lined with certificates and commendations, but it was the single-framed photograph behind his desk that told the real story of his dreams. A pristine 42-foot sloop cutting through azure waters, her white sails billowed against an endless sky. Harold wasn't just dreaming, he was planning. For 15 years, every spare moment had been dedicated to preparing for what he called the final chapter. He had earned his day skipper certification at 55, his coastal skipper at 58, and his yachtmaster qualification at 61. His study at home resembled a maritime academy. Charts covered every surface, navigation equipment lined the shelves, and stacks of sailing manuals were annotated in his precise handwriting. His wife, Margaret, used to joke that he knew more about celestial navigation than most professional captains, and she wasn't wrong. The boat that would carry his dream was christened Persistence, a Hallberg Rasse 42 that he had purchased from a Swedish dealer and spent 2 years meticulously refitting. Harold treated the vessel like a patient requiring surgery. He replaced every through-hull fitting, rewired the entire electrical system, and installed redundant safety equipment that exceeded even the most stringent blue water sailing standards. The boat carried 2 GPS units, 3 VHF radios, an EPIRB, a life raft rated for 12 people, and enough emergency food and water for 90 days. Harold had even learned to repair diesel engines, electronics, and sail systems himself. When Margaret passed away from cancer in the spring of 2019, Harold made a decision that surprised no one who truly knew him. He would complete their shared dream alone. "She always said the sea was calling me," he told his adult children. "I promised her I'd answer that call." His daughter Sarah tried to dissuade him, but Harold's mind was made up. At 64, recently widowed, and with nothing left to prove to anyone, he would sail solo across the Atlantic, from Portsmouth to Barbados, a journey of approximately 3,800 nautical miles. The preparation phase was vintage Harold Whitmore, obsessive, methodical, and thorough. He spent months planning his route, studying weather patterns, and consulting with professional solo sailors. He attended a sea survival course, completed a radio operator's license, and even took a basic psychology course focused on isolation and stress management. Harold left nothing to chance, or so it seemed. On the morning of October 15th, 2019, Harold cast off from Portsmouth Harbour under perfect conditions. The forecast called for light winds and calm seas for the first week. His children had gathered to see him off, and despite their obvious worry, they couldn't help but admire their father's determination. At 64, Harold looked every inch the experienced mariner. Weathered sailing jacket, confident posture, and that characteristic half-smile that had reassured thousands of patients over the decades. "I'll call in every day at 1800 GMT, he promised, keying the microphone of his SSB radio. "Keep track of me on the GPS tracker. I'll see you all in Barbados for Christmas." The first 2 weeks of Harold's journey unfolded exactly as planned. His daily radio check-ins were punctual and professional, delivered in the same calm, measured tone he had used to discuss diagnoses with worried families. He reported his position, weather conditions, boat status, and his own physical condition with clinical precision. The GPS tracker showed him making steady progress southwest, averaging 120 nautical miles per day. Excellent time for a solo sailor. Day 14, came his voice over the radio, clear and confident. Position 53 degrees, 12 minutes north, 28 degrees, 47 minutes west. Barometric pressure steady at 10 to 18 millibars. Boat systems all functioning normally. I'm making excellent time. The weather's been a gift. Margaret would have loved these conditions. Those listening to his check-ins, primarily his daughter Sarah and his sailing club in Portsmouth, noted his increasingly positive mood. Harold seemed to be thriving in solitude, finding the rhythm of solo sailing that so many dream of but few achieve. He spoke of spectacular sunsets, curious dolphins, and the profound peace of being alone with the sea. His voice carried a contentment that his family hadn't heard since before Margaret's illness. By day 20, Harold was approximately 1,400 miles from Portsmouth and well into the deep Atlantic. His daily reports continued to paint a picture of a man completely in his element. He described repairing a minor leak in the forward head, adjusting the wind vane steering, and even catching a small dorado that he had grilled for dinner. Everything suggested a textbook solo Atlantic crossing in progress. But if you knew what to listen for, and the maritime psychologists who would later analyze his radio transcripts certainly did, there were subtle changes beginning to emerge in Harold's communications. His reports, while still professional, were becoming slightly longer, more detailed. He began to mention small equipment issues that he had never reported before. A GPS unit that occasionally showed incorrect readings, a barometer that seemed to be dropping faster than expected, compass variations that didn't match his charts. Day 23, Harold reported, his voice still calm but carrying an almost imperceptible edge. Position 47 degrees, 8 minutes north, 34 degrees, 19 minutes west. I've been having some interesting challenges with the electronics. Nothing serious, but the primary GPS has been showing some anomalous readings. I've switched to the backup unit, and the positions don't quite match. Probably solar storm interference. I've read about that affecting satellite systems out here. What Harold was describing was, in fact, impossible. Solar storms capable of disrupting GPS signals create widespread, documented interference that affects multiple systems globally. There had been no solar storm activity reported during his crossing. Both of his GPS units were high-end Garmin devices, recently serviced and verified before departure. The anomalous readings were most likely correct positions that Harold's increasingly stressed mind was interpreting as errors. The human brain, under extreme isolation and stress, doesn't fail dramatically. It fails gradually, subtly, in ways that can seem entirely rational to the person experiencing the decline. Harold's medical training had taught him about the physiological effects of prolonged isolation, disrupted sleep patterns, altered perception, and gradually impaired judgment. What he couldn't see was that these symptoms were already affecting him. By day 28, Harold's position put him roughly 2,000 miles from Portsmouth and approaching the halfway point of his journey. His check-ins were becoming less punctual, sometimes arriving an hour early, sometimes 2 hours late. When questioned by his daughter about the timing inconsistencies, Harold's explanations were perfectly logical, but increasingly complex. The radio propagation has been unpredictable, he explained during one delayed check-in. I've been having to try different frequencies and different times of day to get through clearly. The atmospheric conditions out here are quite different from what I expected. I'm having to adapt my communication schedule to the reality of deep ocean radio work. Again, Harold's explanation was technically sophisticated and completely wrong. Radio propagation conditions were normal for that time of year and location. The frequencies he was using were well established for transatlantic communication. What was changing wasn't the radio conditions. It was Harold's ability to accurately track time and maintain consistent routines. The first genuinely alarming transmission came on day 32. Harold's voice, while still recognizable, carried a tension that immediately concerned everyone listening. This is Persistence calling Portsmouth Radio. Portsmouth Radio. I need to report a situation. I've been tracking what appears to be another vessel on a parallel course for the past 3 days. They're maintaining a consistent distance, approximately 2 miles to starboard. I've attempted to contact them on channel 16, but they're not responding to radio calls. They appear to be shadowing my course changes. I'm not sure of their intentions, but I wanted to report this as a precautionary measure. Sarah immediately contacted the Maritime Rescue Coordination Center, who checked all available ship traffic data for Harold's reported position. There were no vessels within 50 miles of persistence. The nearest commercial traffic was a container ship more than 200 miles to the north, following the standard shipping lane to Europe. When officials attempted to contact Harold to inform him that no other vessels were in his vicinity, his response was calm but disturbing. I understand that your radar and AIS systems may not be detecting them, Harold replied, but I can see them clearly. White hull, approximately 40 feet, single mast. They've been maintaining position for 3 days now. They alter course when I alter course. I'm keeping a careful log of their movements. The phenomenon Harold was experiencing, seeing phantom vessels in empty ocean, is actually well documented among solo sailors. Extended isolation, combined with the brain's constant attempt to find patterns in the endless, featureless horizon, can create remarkably convincing visual hallucinations. The fact that Harold's ghost ship remained at a consistent distance and mirrored his course changes was textbook. His subconscious was creating a logical narrative to explain the hallucination. But Harold was too intelligent, too trained in medical diagnosis to accept such an explanation. When the Rescue Coordination Center gently suggested that he might be experiencing the effects of prolonged isolation, Harold's response revealed how completely his rational mind was rationalizing irrational perceptions. I appreciate your concern, he said, his voice carrying the patient tone he had once used with worried patients who questioned his diagnosis. But I've been monitoring my own psychological state very carefully. I'm sleeping adequately, eating regularly, and maintaining my daily routines. I've read extensively about solo sailing hallucinations, and what I'm observing doesn't match those patterns. This vessel is real, and I'm documenting everything. Day 35 brought another concerning transmission. Harold reported that the shadowing vessel had moved closer during the night, now within 1 mile of his position. His voice carried a mixture of fascination and unease that chilled everyone listening. They moved in under cover of darkness, Harold reported. I woke around 0300 hours to check the boat, and they had closed to within 1 mile. When I turned on my masthead light and shined it in their direction, they immediately altered course to re-establish their previous distance. It's as if they're deliberately avoiding direct contact while maintaining surveillance. The psychological profile Harold was displaying, elaborate, internally consistent delusions defended with logical reasoning, was becoming textbook paranoid thinking. But because Harold was an intelligent, medically trained individual with no history of mental illness, and because his delusions were complex and detailed rather than obviously bizarre, they seemed convincing even to professionals monitoring his communications. Dr. Elizabeth Morrison, a maritime psychologist who would later analyze Harold's case, explained the insidious nature of this type of psychological breakdown. Intelligent individuals experiencing isolation-induced psychosis often create sophisticated explanatory frameworks for their hallucinations because they're smart enough to make their delusions internally consistent, and because they retain their basic communication skills, they can be extraordinarily convincing. Harold wasn't raving. He was methodically documenting what seemed to him to be a very real threat. By day 40, Harold's reports had taken on an increasingly urgent tone. The phantom vessel, according to his detailed logs, was now coordinating with other boats. Harold reported seeing flashing lights between vessels at night, course changes that seemed to be communicating information, and even what he interpreted as deliberate attempts to interfere with his radio communications. I've identified at least 3 distinct vessels now, Harold reported during his increasingly erratic check-ins. They're operating in coordination, one to the north, one to the east, and the original vessel to starboard. They're using some form of light-based communication system at night. When I attempt to photograph them during daylight, they alter their positions to avoid clear documentation. It's sophisticated, deliberate, and I believe they may be attempting to interfere with my passage. The escalation of Harold's delusions followed a pattern that would later become a textbook study in solo sailing psychology. As his isolation continued, His mind created increasingly elaborate explanations for the phantom stimuli it was generating. The single ghost ship became multiple vessels. Random radio interference became deliberate jamming attempts. Natural variations in weather and sea conditions became evidence of pursuit and surveillance. What made Harold's case particularly tragic was his medical background. His clinical training gave him a framework for detailed observation and documentation that made his delusions seem more credible, both to himself and to others. He was conducting what appeared to be careful scientific observation of a phenomenon that existed only in his increasingly compromised mind. Day 43 marked the beginning of Harold's final descent. His morning check-in arrived 6 hours late, and when he finally came on the radio, his voice carried a quality that immediately alarmed everyone listening. A forced calm that barely contained underlying panic. "This is Persistence. I need to report that they made contact during the night. I was awakened around 0200 hours by the sound of someone moving around on deck. When I investigated, I found that my life raft had been tampered with. The securing straps were loosened, but not completely released. It appears to be some form of psychological warfare. They want me to know they were here without actually disabling the boat." The Maritime Rescue Coordination Center immediately began coordinating resources for a potential rescue operation. Harold's GPS tracker showed him at approximately 41 Vestagrand, 40 degrees Dals, roughly 1,500 miles east of the Azores and 2,400 miles from his destination. He was in some of the deepest, most remote waters of the Atlantic Ocean. But when rescue coordinators attempted to convince Harold to activate his EPIRB and abandon his journey, his response revealed the complete grip his delusions now held over his decision-making process. "I understand your concern," Harold replied, his voice carrying an eerie echo of his former professional bedside manner. "But activating an emergency beacon would only confirm to them that their psychological tactics are working. I've come too far to allow them to force me to abandon Margaret's dream. I'm going to continue the passage, but I'm taking additional security precautions." The security precautions Harold described over the following days painted a picture of a brilliant mind systematically destroying itself. He began sleeping in 2-hour shifts, convinced that longer rest periods would allow his pursuers to board his boat. He started rationing his food, believing that his supplies might have been tampered with. Most concerning of all, he began to doubt his navigation equipment, convinced that his GPS positions were being deliberately corrupted. "I've been cross-checking my electronic navigation with celestial sights," Harold reported on day 46. "There are significant discrepancies. My GPS units are showing positions that don't match my sun sights by nearly 20 miles. I believe they have the capability to interfere with satellite navigation. I'm going to rely primarily on celestial navigation from this point forward. For a skilled navigator, celestial navigation can be remarkably accurate." But Harold's mental state was now compromised to the point where the complex calculations required for celestial positioning were beyond his capabilities. The discrepancies he was finding between his GPS positions and his celestial calculations were the result of his impaired mathematical abilities, not satellite interference. By abandoning his GPS units, Harold was cutting himself off from the most reliable means of determining his true position. Day 48 brought the transmission that would haunt maritime rescue personnel for years to come. Harold's voice, now carrying an unmistakable edge of barely controlled terror, delivered a report that chilled everyone listening. "They're closing in," Harold whispered into the radio, as if afraid of being overheard. "All 3 vessels have moved to within half a mile. They're coordinating their approach. I can see them clearly now. They're not showing any flags or identification numbers. The crew members I can observe are wearing dark clothing and appear to be watching me through binoculars. I think they're going to attempt to board tonight." The psychological phenomenon Harold was experiencing had reached its most dangerous phase. His hallucinations were no longer passive observations. They had become an active threat that demanded response. The rational part of his mind that had served him so well as a physician was now completely subsumed by a delusional system that interpreted every shadow, every wave, every natural sound as evidence of imminent danger. Dr. Morrison, analyzing the case years later, identified this as the critical moment when Harold's condition shifted from concerning to life-threatening. When hallucinations become interactive, when the patient believes they must respond to or defend against them, that's when isolated individuals make fatal decisions. Harold's medical training, which had given him the tools to monitor and rationalize his condition, was now working against him. He was clinically documenting his own psychological destruction. The final 48 hours of Harold's journey remain the subject of intense analysis by maritime psychologists, rescue professionals, and solo sailing organizations worldwide. His radio transmissions during this period provide a chilling, real-time account of a brilliant mind's complete surrender to delusion. Day 49 began with Harold reporting that his pursuers had withdrawn during the night, but his relief was short-lived. By evening, his transmissions indicated that he believed his boat's systems were being systematically sabotaged. "They've done something to the wind vane steering," Harold reported, his voice tight with controlled panic. "It's not responding correctly. I'm having to hand steer, but I can't maintain course and watch for their approach at the same time. I think they're trying to force me to drop my guard." The wind vane steering on Persistence was actually functioning normally. Harold's GPS tracker showed the boat maintaining a reasonably consistent course. What had failed was Harold's ability to trust his own equipment and his own senses. Every normal variation in the boat's behavior, every standard response to changing wind and sea conditions, was now interpreted through the lens of sabotage and pursuit. That night brought the transmission that maritime rescue personnel still use as a training example of how quickly solo sailing emergencies can escalate beyond all hope of rescue. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Persistence. They're boarding the boat. I can hear them moving around on deck. I've locked myself in the main cabin, but they're trying to force the companionway. I don't know what they want, but I'm not going to let them take Margaret's dream away from me." The Rescue Coordination Center immediately began mobilizing every available asset. The nearest Coast Guard cutter was 14 hours away at maximum speed. A merchant vessel was diverted to Harold's last known position, but it would take nearly 20 hours to reach him. In the vast emptiness of the mid-Atlantic, Harold was utterly alone with his disintegrating mind. The transmissions that followed over the next 6 hours would later be analyzed by psychologists, psychiatrists, and maritime safety experts as one of the most complete real-time documentations of acute psychotic breakdown ever recorded. Harold's voice, alternating between whispered fear and forced professional calm, painted a terrifying picture of a battle that existed only in his mind. "They're cutting through the companionway door," Harold whispered at 2:47 GMT. "I can hear metal on metal. I've prepared a defense, but there are at least 4 of them. I don't understand what they want with me." 20 minutes later, "They've gotten into the main cabin, but I've retreated to the forward cabin. I've barricaded the door. I can hear them searching through my charts and equipment. They're looking for something." At 0356 GMT, "I think I understand now. They're not after the boat. They're after my navigation data. They want to know my exact position, my planned route. This isn't random piracy. This is organized, professional." The tragic irony of Harold's final hours was that his medical training, the very quality that had made him such a meticulous sailor, was now providing sophisticated explanations for completely impossible events. His rational mind was creating logical narratives to explain the products of his hallucinating subconscious. At 0623 GMT on November 2nd, 2019, day 50 of Harold's journey, came the transmission that would define his case in maritime psychology literature forever. His voice, now carrying an eerie mixture of triumph and terror, delivered words that still give experienced sailors chills. "I've outsmarted them. They think they have me trapped, but I know something they don't. I know these waters. I've studied every chart, every current, every weather pattern. There's a place about 12 miles southeast of my position where the continental shelf drops away to more than 3,000 fathoms. If I can reach those waters, they won't be able to follow me. Their boats aren't built for deep ocean work like Persistence is." The chilling logic of Harold's final plan was perfect and perfectly wrong. There was no continental shelf in his area of the Atlantic Ocean. His position, according to his GPS tracker, put him over waters more than 15,000 feet deep, nowhere near any underwater topography that would provide the tactical advantage he believed he was seeking. Harold's detailed study of charts and oceanography, corrupted by his psychological breakdown, was leading him to navigate toward a salvation that didn't exist. The final transmission from Harold Whitmore came at 0847 GMT, 51 days after his departure from Portsmouth. His voice, now carrying an almost childlike excitement, delivered the words that would haunt everyone who heard them. "I can see the shelf. The watercolor is changing. It's that deep blue that means thousands of fathoms. They'll never follow me here. Persistence can handle these waters, but their boats can't. I'm going to motor at full speed toward the deep water. Once I reach the thermal layer, their sonar won't be able to track me. Margaret always said I was too clever for my own good." Harold's final words were followed by the sound of his diesel engine starting, running at high RPM for approximately 6 minutes, then falling silent. His GPS tracker continued transmitting for another 43 minutes, showing Persistence moving southeast at approximately 8 knots before the signal was lost. The merchant vessel Ocean Provider reached Harold's last known position 36 hours later, finding only scattered debris, a few cushions, an empty water container, and a single page from what appeared to be a ship's log, the ink smeared beyond readability. The sea had claimed both Harold and his beloved Persistence, leaving behind only questions and a radio recording that would reshape understanding of solo sailing psychology. The official Coast Guard investigation, completed 8 months later, painted a clear picture of what had actually occurred during Harold's final hours. The debris pattern, ocean current analysis, and examination of his GPS track revealed that Harold had deliberately motored his boat toward what he believed to be deep water, capable of providing refuge from his hallucinatory pursuers. In reality, he was heading directly into increasingly rough seas generated by a weather system that his compromised mind had been unable to properly assess. The final GPS positions showed Persistence's track becoming increasingly erratic in the boat's final 43 minutes, suggesting that Harold was struggling to maintain control in worsening conditions while still believing he was executing a brilliant tactical maneuver. The abrupt cessation of the GPS signal indicated either catastrophic structural failure or that the boat had been overwhelmed by breaking waves. Dr. Morrison's analysis, published 2 years later in the Journal of Maritime Psychology, identified Harold's case as a textbook example of what she termed competent deterioration, the way highly skilled, intelligent individuals can experience complete psychological breakdown while retaining enough cognitive function to make their delusions seem rational and their decisions appear logical. Harold Whitmore was an exceptional individual, brilliant, methodical, and extraordinarily well prepared, Dr. Morrison wrote, but these very qualities made his psychological deterioration more dangerous, not less. His medical training gave him the vocabulary to rationalize his symptoms. His sailing expertise gave him the technical knowledge to make fatal decisions seem reasonable. His intelligence allowed him to create complex explanatory frameworks for impossible situations. The case study became required reading in solo sailing preparation courses worldwide. Harold's meticulous documentation of his own psychological breakdown, preserved in his radio transmissions, provides an unprecedented real-time view of how the mind can betray even the most prepared and competent individual. Perhaps most chilling was the discovery, during the investigation, that Harold had actually been making remarkable progress on his crossing. Analysis of weather data showed that he had successfully navigated several challenging weather systems and was actually ahead of his planned schedule when his psychological deterioration began. Had he maintained his original course and trusted his equipment, Harold would likely have reached Barbados safely, fulfilling his and Margaret's shared dream. Instead, the very qualities that made Harold an exceptional doctor and sailor, his attention to detail, his analytical mind, his refusal to accept simple explanations for complex problems, became the instruments of his destruction when applied to the products of his deteriorating mental state. The Harold Whitmore case fundamentally changed how the sailing community approaches solo long-distance voyaging. His story is now used to illustrate why even the most experienced sailors should maintain regular contact with shore-based support, carry modern satellite communication equipment, and have predetermined criteria for abandoning a voyage when psychological stress becomes a factor. But perhaps Harold's most lasting legacy is the haunting reminder that the human mind, like the sea itself, contains depths that can swallow even the most prepared explorer. His final radio call, confident, logical, and utterly wrong, stands as a testament to the terrifying fragility of human perception when pushed beyond its limits. In the end, Harold Whitmore achieved a form of immortality that he never sought. His name is spoken in hushed tones in sailing clubs around the world, not as a cautionary tale of poor seamanship, but as a reminder that the greatest dangers we face on the ocean often come not from wind and wave, but from the mysterious depths of our own minds. The coordinates where persistence was lost, 41°12N, 39°47W, remain unmarked on any chart. But for those who sail alone into the vast emptiness of the world's oceans, Harold's final position serves as an invisible monument to the courage required to dream big and the price that courage sometimes demands. His daughter Sarah, now an advocate for solo sailing safety, keeps his final photograph on her desk. Harold, at the helm of Persistence during their last family sail before Margaret's illness, his face bright with anticipation for adventures still to come. He died doing what he loved, she says, chasing a dream that was bigger than his fear. I think Margaret would have been proud of his courage, even if she would have been heartbroken by his fate. Nautical. The sea keeps its secrets, but Harold Whitmore's story continues to echo across the waves, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous journey we can take is the one into the uncharted waters of our own minds.